Please be seated. Young people dismissed for junior church. So in order to prepare ourselves for Advent, for the Christmas season, what I'm going to do this year is start at the beginning. Because as you probably know, Advent is not the beginning of the story. It is not chapter 1 of the story of God's redemption. For want of a better term, let's call it chapter 4, episode 4, if you will, because you know what? It is, and this is, I know, nerdy, but I can't help myself. It is a new hope that we see beginning with Advent. And it's right in the middle of the story, a change of things. But I want to also focus for a second on the thoughts and the philosophies and the understanding of the world that Jesus came into. Because most of the people living then believed in some form of cosmological dualism. And that's a fancy schmancy philosophy term, but it basically means that they believed that the universe was in an eternal balance between good and evil. That there always has been evil, there always will be. There always has been good and there always will be. They're in some kind of balance. You're probably familiar with that thought from Chinese philosophy like Taoism and Confucianism with the yin and the yang. That's quite an ancient way of thinking. That's very common in the East. You see echoes of that in Hinduism and Buddhism with reincarnation, with the idea that history is cyclical. It doesn't move in a straight line from a beginning to an end, but it repeats itself over and over and over again, never really changing. But that was also quite common in the Near East, in the land of Jesus' birth, not amongst the Jews, but amongst their neighbors. The Greeks believed in something called Gnostic dualism, and this was influential on Christianity and something that the early church wrestled with, rejecting some of its errors. In that Greek philosophy, the thought was that everything's spiritual, our souls in the spiritual realm is good, but this physical realm, our bodies and this world that we live in, that is where the evil is. You see that in Paul's message in Athens, because when he proclaimed Jesus Christ resurrected, brought back from the dead, back to his physical body, they laughed at him because they thought that was nutty. Why would anyone want to come back to this evil world when you've been liberated and your soul is free? About the same time as the birth of Christ, you have to the east a religion called Zoroastrianism. And you probably never heard of Zoroastrianism. It died out after the 7th century, and that area of Persia and Iran became a hotbed and a heartland of Islam. But until then, from the 5th century BC until about the 7th century AD, you have a man who set up a religion called Zoroastrianism where you had two independent gods. You had a god of light and a god of darkness, and we were caught in the middle of that. And also from the 3rd century, coming out of that same area, you have another version of this called Manichaeism. And it also spread rapidly until the 7th century. And that also taught of a world of light and a world of darkness. As a matter of fact, one of Christianity's most influential men, St. Augustine, was a Manichaeist, believed in that philosophy of an eternal struggle between light and dark until he was a grown man, and then eventually coming to faith in Jesus Christ. So there were a lot of people, and probably until the rise of the spread of Christianity into Europe and then later the rise of Islam, I would say that the majority of the world's people believed in a world where light and dark were eternally in combat. That no one would ever get the upper hand, that this was always the way it was and always the way it would be. Now you can imagine that leads to fatalism. This is the way of the world. We can't really change it. Nothing is new. Nothing can be done about it. But Christianity and Judaism before us, we do not believe in cyclical history. We believe in linear history. History has a past that was different. And it does also have a future that will be different. In the past, in eternity past, there was no evil. And in the future, when the final judgment has come and God has reasserted his dominion, there will no longer be evil. And so we look at a different view of history and a different understanding of humanity. And so that understanding begins in the book of Genesis. In the chapter 3, verse 15, I'm just going to pick that one verse to put a highlight on this world view and this understanding of the world that Jesus comes into with the Advent. We begin with the very important question: how did this world, with good and evil as we know it now, how did that come to be? The book of Genesis starts us with chapter 1, and it basically, in chapter 1, just lets us see that God is the creator of all things, the one that puts order to the chaos, separates waters from the lands and light from the darkness, and puts everything in its proper place and gives it its function. And then in chapter 2, we saw the introduction of humanity, and God sets up humanity as his stewards to continue that same process in the garden of ordering things and putting things the way they should be. But unfortunately, here in chapter 3, we see the beginning of evil among humanity. We see the downfall, the temptation of human beings to be like God. And that's why we read that passage out of Isaiah that was talking about Lucifer's fall, because that is an echo, wanting to be like God, wanting to order things according to your own standard and your own ideas instead of following the direction of God. This then is the response. Chapter 3, verse 15 is God's response. Now that this has happened, now that rebellion has come into the world, now that individuals have asserted their autonomy from God, how will God respond? This is the beginning, the first time in the scriptures we see the foreshadowing of the advent of the Messiah. And so we'll look at this text. It says, I will put enmity. Nobody is in control of our world here. No human being, no power that exists on this world is directing our history. And yet God asserts that prerogative here in the beginning. He says, I will set this in motion. I will direct it. History will be at my hand. I will be the one who decides the direction it goes in. It is not an impersonal force. It is not an accident of the way things are, but it is a plan. And God is saying here, I will direct this because this rebellion against me will not be permanent. I will change this, and someday I will defeat it. And here God sets forth that plan, shares it with Adam and Eve and the serpent as they begin this path that will one day lead to Bethlehem. And he says, I will put that enmity between you and the woman. And this is an interesting insight, because you might have thought, and we might have assumed, that at this moment, when humanity has rebelled against God, like Lucifer did before falling to become Satan, we don't know that in the story yet, but we'll learn that later, that humanity would be written off. Nowhere are we told in the scriptures that God has a plan and has made any effort to redeem the fallen angels, to give them a Messiah, to give them a second chance. And yet he is saying here that there will be a divide between you and the woman, between the forces of darkness, the prince of darkness himself, between Satan and his demon followers. There will be a divide between them and fallen humanity. And that might not seem like the case sometimes. It might seem like humanity is wholly evil. We read the news, we read history books, and we sometimes think, oh my goodness, we're hopeless. But that is not the case. We are fallen, but we are not forgotten. And so in this very beginning, we see an act of God's grace, that humanity will not be written off, but there will be a divide between darkness and the seed and the descendants of man. How will God do that? That will be unfolded beginning in the chapters that come as God works through his prophets, as God sends his law, as God makes his covenants to keep humanity afloat until the time of their redemption. And notice that the enmity is between the offspring of both of these protagonists. The future showdown is set in motion by God. And on one hand, we have the highest created being, the most powerful being in the universe that is not God. And on the other side, you see a child of human beings. That really feels like a lopsided fight. That doesn't seem like it has any chance of coming out in the favor of the offspring of the woman. Yet it will be, but not for the reason that Satan would hope. It will be a lopsided fight. It will be entirely lopsided, and the outcome will never be in doubt. Fragile, limited, mortal flesh will be the path chosen by God to assault the powers of darkness. This is an amazing prediction and prophecy that God is setting forth here, that he will work through humanity to save humanity. God will find power through weakness and limitation. God will create glory through humility. This is the first mention of the Messiah. The prophets will later lay out his mission and what he will be like. But this is the beginning of the idea of the Messiah that the Hebrew Scriptures will flesh out over time, that it will be an offspring of the woman. And what will this offspring then do? They will be at war with each other, darkness and light. He will crush your head. You see, the final victory of God at the end will be total. It will not be a balance between light and dark. It will not be a duality where neither side prevails. But instead, God is promising that one day when that offspring comes, he will crush you, speaking to the serpent. Rebellion will have its day, and we will see it get worse before it gets better. It will get worse from here in Genesis, Cain and Abel, and then Noah and the flood, and then the Tower of Babel, and all of the evil that exists in the world, Sodom and Gomorrah and all of that. But it will not be permanent. Once more, God will reign unchallenged, with no rivals and no rebels. Once more, God's sovereignty will be reasserted, because in eternity past there was no evil. In eternity future, there will also be no evil. Evil is never more than a mockery, a negation of good. And this is an important thing for us to understand in Christian theology and Christian worldviews. Satan cannot create anything. He never could. Only God has the prerogative and the power to create, as we say, ex nihilo, from nothing. By the power of his hand alone, God can create life and make the visible world that we live in. Satan can only mar and mock and ruin and twist what God has made. God and God alone is sovereign. He promised from the very beginning that he will reassert that dominance and he will crush all those who rebel against him. The final picture of that laid forth in the apocalypse that John saw. The crushing at the battle of Armageddon of all rebellion against God. You see, it was never an even contest. This outcome was always inevitable. There was never even a hint of a way for creatures to rebel successfully against Creator, for humanity or Satan or any other power to rebel against God and maintain that rebellion, for This truth is one that God will reveal to Moses when he tells him his name. I am. Only God is God. Only God is self-existent. Only God is non-contingent. Only God needs no other. But at what cost will that victory be won? The moment of Satan's greatest triumph, that dark day at Gethsemane, when the sun is not shining and the Son of God breathes his last after crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? That moment when Satan believes that he has triumphed, the death of God's chosen one, his Messiah upon the cross, will actually be the final nail in the coffin of Satan's rebellion. He will not know it until 3 days later, but that death will have already sealed his defeat. The death of the Messiah will be history's greatest Pyrrhic victory. A Pyrrhic victory named after a Greek general who defeated the Romans in battle a couple of times. And his generals said to him, "You've won." And he said, "No, I've lost, because my victories cost me so much that this war, we will lose it." And they did. And we've kept that term ever since. Satan's defeat in his own eyes of Jesus at the cross is the greatest fool's victory. Because death inflicting upon a sinless Jesus will in effect kill itself, and death will be destroyed by killing the Son of God. The scars that exist upon Jesus' wrists and feet and side will be the marks of victory, not defeat. Excuse me. And so here we have laid out in Genesis the entirety of God's plan. The details we will see unfolded later. And it will be many, many generations between here and Abraham, between Abraham and David, between David and Jesus. It will be a long time until God brings this plan to its fulfillment. But this day, from the very beginning, God set it in motion. And so we have three things to learn from this that impact our understanding of Christmas. And the first one is that history has always had a plan. History has never been accidental, haphazard. I love the books. I have a bunch of them at home about the what-ifs of history. What if this thing had happened differently? What if this one thing had happened differently? How might our world be different? But of course, that was never an option. God has always had a plan and has brought that to fulfillment, and he will to this day and will till the end of time. Secondly, the reality that God chose to work through humanity to save humanity from itself. Rather than saving us from the outside only, God will step into humanity and use us to save us. And then lastly, the final victory of God, assured at the cross and the empty tomb, begun in the manger at Bethlehem, will be absolutely total.